Most people assume that having very few friends is a social weakness. But here's a paradox that psychology has been quietly exploring for years. Some of the people with the smallest social circles also possess a mental strength that many others never fully develop. Not because they're better than everyone else, and not because they dislike people, but because spending less time depending on constant social validation can change the way the mind works in surprising ways. Of course, this doesn't mean that everyone with few friends has this ability. Loneliness can be painful, and healthy relationships are one of the strongest predictors of well-being. But if you've naturally found yourself with only a handful of close connections, or sometimes none at all, you may have developed a psychological power that often goes unnoticed. That power is independent thinking. At first, that may not sound particularly impressive. After all, everyone likes to believe they think for themselves. But cognitive psychologists have shown that our decisions are influenced by other people far more than we realize. The opinions we hear repeatedly begin to feel true. The behaviors we see every day slowly become normal. Even our preferences, what we wear, buy, believe, or admire, are often shaped by subtle social influence rather than conscious choice. The human brain is designed this way for a reason. For most of history, belonging to a group meant survival. Being accepted increased the chances of finding food, protection, and support. As a result, our brains became highly sensitive to social approval. Deep inside the brain, systems connected to reward and motivation respond positively when we feel accepted, while rejection can activate many of the same regions associated with physical pain. In other words, the desire to belong isn't a weakness, it's part of being human. But here's where things become interesting. When someone spends long periods without constantly seeking approval from a large social circle, the brain is often forced to solve problems differently. Instead of asking, "What does everyone else think?" the mind gradually becomes more comfortable asking, "What do I actually think?" That shift may seem small, but over time it can completely change how a person approaches life. Independent thinking doesn't mean rejecting other people's ideas. It means creating enough mental space to evaluate them, instead of automatically accepting them. Research in social psychology has repeatedly demonstrated how easily people conform to group opinions, even when those opinions are clearly incorrect. In classic experiments, participants knowingly gave wrong answers simply because everyone else in the room did the same. The pressure to fit in was stronger than their own perception. Now imagine reducing that pressure. Without constant exposure to group expectations, some people naturally become more reflective. They spend more time examining their own beliefs, questioning assumptions, and noticing contradictions in their own thinking. Instead of reacting immediately, they pause. And that pause is more powerful than it appears. Because many of life's biggest mistakes don't come from a lack of intelligence, they come from automatic thinking. Here's something worth asking yourself. When you make an important decision, are you choosing what genuinely feels right to you, or what simply feels normal because you've seen other people do it? Most of us rarely stop to ask that question. The brain loves shortcuts. Psychologists call them mental models and cognitive biases. They help us make quick decisions without exhausting mental energy, but they also make us surprisingly easy to influence. Advertisements, social media trends, workplace culture, family expectations, even casual conversations quietly shape the way we see ourselves and the world. People who spend more time alone aren't automatically immune to these influences, but they often have something valuable that many busy social lives don't naturally provide: silence. And psychologically, silence is not empty. It's where reflection begins. Silence gives the brain an opportunity to process experiences instead of simply reacting to them. Neuroscientists have found that during quiet moments, when you're not constantly responding to conversations, notifications, or outside demands, the brain remains remarkably active. It begins connecting memories, evaluating emotions, and organizing information. In many ways, this is when your mind starts making sense of your life. That may explain why some people with fewer friendships develop a strong sense of self. Their identity is shaped a little less by social expectations and a little more by personal reflection. They don't always ask, "Who do people want me to be?" Instead, they gradually begin asking, "Who am I when nobody is watching?" Psychology suggests that this question is surprisingly important. A stable identity isn't built by never changing. It's built by understanding why you change. People who regularly reflect on their thoughts and emotions often become better at recognizing their own behavioral patterns. They notice what drains them, what motivates them, and what truly aligns with their values. This kind of self-awareness doesn't eliminate mistakes, but it often leads to better decisions over time. There's another interesting pattern researchers have observed. People who are comfortable being alone often become less controlled by the fear of missing out. They still enjoy meaningful relationships, but they don't feel the same urgency to say yes to every invitation or follow every trend. Their emotional state depends a little less on external stimulation and a little more on internal stability. That doesn't mean they never feel lonely. Loneliness and solitude are not the same thing. Loneliness is the painful feeling of lacking meaningful connection. Solitude, on the other hand, is the ability to be alone without feeling disconnected from yourself. One drains your energy, the other can restore it. The difference isn't the number of people around you, it's the quality of your relationship with your own mind. Of course, none of this means you should avoid friendships. Decades of psychological research consistently show that close, supportive relationships improve both mental and physical health. Humans are social by nature, and genuine connection remains one of our deepest psychological needs. The goal isn't to have no friends. The goal is to make sure your identity doesn't depend entirely on them. Because when your entire sense of self relies on constant approval, every disagreement feels like rejection, every criticism feels like failure, and every moment alone feels uncomfortable. But when you develop an inner sense of stability, relationships become something you choose, not something you desperately need to validate your existence. And perhaps that's the quiet power many people never notice. It's the ability to think before following, to pause before reacting, to question your own assumptions instead of automatically accepting them, to enjoy company without fearing solitude. Ironically, these qualities often remain invisible. They don't attract attention. They don't make someone the loudest person in the room. But over a lifetime, they can influence nearly every important decision a person makes, from the career they choose to the relationships they build and the values they decide to live by. So if you have only a few close friends, or you're going through a season where your social circle is smaller than you'd like, don't rush to label yourself as socially unsuccessful. Instead, ask a different question. Has this experience taught you something about yourself that constant noise never could? Because sometimes the greatest advantage isn't having more voices around you. Sometimes it's having enough quiet to finally hear your own. And in a world that constantly competes for your attention, that may be one of the rarest psychological strengths of all.